Welcome to the Oops in Translation podcast once again. Thank you very much for joining us. And on our show, we'll be doing some interviews with some interesting people, some standouts, some wonderful people who are highlighting life and dynamics across different cultures. And so today we have our very first guest, actually, Anne Crescini. And she's an author, she's a teacher, she's a scholar, she's a jack of all trades. And so we're going to invite her in. We're going to have a wonderful conversation about some of the stuff that she's been sharing with actually across over years. She's got a few books out and a few TED Talks as well, a couple TED Talks that we've wanted to pick her brain about. So we'll talk to her now. Hello, Anne.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you very, very much for joining us. This is really, really exciting for us. You're the first person we're getting to interview on the Oops in Translation podcast. And so today we wanted to actually first, maybe you could share a little bit about yourself. I introduced you as a jack of all trades, an author, a scholar, a teacher, but I know since you do so many things, I don't know, how do you describe the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out. Just let me give you a brief introduction. My name is Anne Crescini. I was born and raised in Virginia in the United States. I moved to Japan when I was 24 years old, and I've lived here for about half my life. I'm now 51. Lived 25 years in each country. I am an associate professor at the University of Kyushu, which is in Fukuoka Prefecture on the southern island of Kyushu. In addition to teaching at university, I write books, I do a newspaper column, I give lectures mainly about language and culture diversity, that sort of thing. I also do TV sometimes, and I have my own radio show, and I do a lot of different stuff. Sometimes I do translation, narration, interpreting, that kind of stuff. But I just love life. I love learning about Japan. I love teaching people about Japan and sharing my experiences. Mainly, just like half of my lectures are full of like just failures on my part and how that's changed me and made me to the person who I am today. And I think that's very relatable. I think a lot of people can relate a lot better to failure than to success. And so, I try not to take myself too seriously, and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's me. And I have 3 kids, and they were born and raised here. And I think we're going to talk about that later. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here and share my experiences with you guys today.
Yes. Thank you again so much for your presence, sharing your experience with us. Actually, the thing that kind of brought us together was this was actually the conversation that Brooke and I were having. We watched the TED Talk that you had in Fukuoka. I think it's Fukuoka, right?
The first one that I did?
I think it was, maybe like 7 years ago or so. Mm-hmm. And in that talk, there was a lot of interesting things you shared, but basically it was sort of your personal journey, coming to Japan from the US. Mm-hmm. And the realizations that you kind of come to regarding sort of worldview and sort of your coming into a cultural understanding of what Japan is and the people and just how to interact with them. It just caught me as a very nuanced and sort of detailed account of how to experience Japan and how to understand its people. And so I thought maybe you could share a little bit with us about how you that entry point, when you first came to Japan. You don't have to restate everything that you shared in that TED Talk, but it's also been some time since you shared that too. So I'm curious to hear about your insights since then.
In general, I just think I've come to the realization recently that human beings are just pretty self-centered, and it's like a very shared trait that we have. I don't think it's intentional, but I think we tend to see everything through the lens of our values and our worldview, and that can cause a lot of problems when you're in a cross-cultural setting, especially. And it's not intentional. It's not like you're trying to be condescending or look down on another culture, but you just assume that the way that you were brought up or the way that you've always done things is the right thing, the right way to do it. And so, I came to Japan when I was 24, had very little cross-cultural experience. I couldn't speak the language at all. I was in a very brought up and raised in a very conservative evangelical Christian community. And I was just a very traditional country girl from the southern part of Virginia. And that kind of really shaped my worldview. And so I was unconsciously, like, I mean, I liked Japan. Obviously, I lived here for many years before I started having all these realizations about worldview. But I had an experience back in 2016, 2017 that really helped to change my life. My best friend is very, traditional Japanese from Kyoto, and we just would fight all the time, just about everything. I mean, we would just fight about how we raised our kids. We would fight about food. It was just like, and I couldn't understand why we were fighting so much, because I saw myself as a Japan expert. I was like, I've got the N1. I've written 12 books about Japan in English. I know Japan. I'm a Japan expert. But then why am I having all these arguments with this Japanese person? I should be able to understand her and her culture. And I realized that I wasn't really understanding Japan, that I was only I was only understanding it on a surface level because I had limited myself, because I was looking at Japan through my lenses and not through Japan's lenses, right? And so my understanding of Japan was limited to my experiences. And so, and what I talked about in the TEDx talk was mainly my experience. I had an eating disorder for many, many years. And my friend taught me how to cook Japanese food and taught me a lot about Japanese food culture. And the main thing about Japanese food culture is the idea of saying "itadakimasu" before eating. And of course I learned that when I first came to Japan. Everybody learns that, that you put your hands together and you say "itadakimasu" before you eat. But I always only had a surface understanding of it. I thought it was, let's eat, kind of like Christians would pray before they eat.
Sure.
And then one day we were making tamago kake gohan, like eating rice, raw egg with rice, and I was going to throw away the egg yolk because I have high cholesterol. And she was like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, I can't eat this because I have high cholesterol. And she goes, "Don't you know what the word itadakimasu means?" And I was just like, "Well, yeah, of course I do. It means, let's eat." And she was like, "That's not what it means." She goes, "It doesn't mean let's eat. It means that you're partaking of life." And I was just like, whoa, that's deep, And I'd never thought of it like that. I'd always thought of it just as kind of a light, let's eat kind of thing. And it was like I had this revelation. It was just like, I'm sure you guys have noticed that Japanese people are crazy obsessed about food. Like they talk about it all the time. I mean, turn on TV and every single TV program is about food in Japan.
Yeah.
That shocked me as an American because, we have the food channel and stuff like that. But every single TV program is not based around food like it is here. And it was kind of like, oh, this is why, because they value food at such a deeper level than I ever had. Kids at preschool will plant their own vegetables and they'll water them and pick them and make curry rice together and eat lunch together. School lunches in Japan are just crazy healthy and delicious. I that all comes, I think, from this whole idea that they are partaking of life. And it was something I'd never really realized before. And it just really revolutionized my view of Japan. And I realized I've lived here for 16 years and I've never heard this before. And it kind of just changed how I saw food, but my worldview didn't necessarily change to, because itadakimasu is a very Shinto Bukkyo Buddhist kind of concept, right? In Christianity, which is my background, we thank God for the food, but in Japan they thank the food directly, right?
Right.
So it's quite different, right? And because in the Shinto worldview, all life is equally valuable, right? And so it's kind of like I'm gonna partake of your life so I can have life, and I'm very thankful for you. Thank you so much, right? They're actually not the gods, but they're actually thanking the food, and that even as a Christian, that was very powerful for me. I was very moved by that, and I thought, you know what, I don't have to necessarily have the same worldview, but I can still be changed by it. And that helped me to be healed of the eating disorder because I started to value food a lot more. And
Yeah.
I think that the biggest thing I learned from that experience is that, we humans can have our values and our religious beliefs and our opinions, and we should be able to hold them. But at the same time, there's so much that we can learn from other cultures and other religions and other thought, other people's thoughts and values. And I think we tend to see, like, I was brought up in a very devout evangelical Christian setting where I was just, Christianity is true and Shintoism are not true. Therefore, there's nothing true in them or nothing that I can learn from them, And so unconsciously, I was thinking, well, I'll just find, anything I need in life should be able to be found in Christianity. And so I was unconsciously looking at everything that Japanese culture or Buddhism or Shinto offered as something that can't make my life better, right? But then I realized that, the Japanese view of food based in Shinto actually healed me and saved my life. And to me, as someone who gives talks on diversity, that's what true diversity should look like. Not that it has to like overwhelm you or change you entirely, but it can make your life better. And we can learn things from each other. And I think the most important thing is to be humble and to realize that sometimes everything you need is not in the people that are around you or the things that you're used to, and if you open your heart up to and open your mind to the possibility that other people could have something that you need, it can really be life-changing. And so that's what I talk about in a lot of my talks that I do about diversity. I'm like, you can be proud of your Japanese culture. You should be proud of being Japanese. You should be proud of your culture, your religious beliefs, your customs. But that doesn't mean you can't learn from other people who live in Japan who might be different from you. So to make a long story short, that's kind of the basis of my TED.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, but I'm still learning. I'm still making mistakes and I'm still growing. So I think life is like that. I mean, I think we just, life is a bunch of failures that we learn from, because you don't grow when you succeed, you grow when you fail, right? And so I think that's something that I've learned over the years.
Yeah, definitely. I shared a little bit with Daniel about this earlier, but when I was watching your TED Talk, it reminded me a little bit about the first time, I think it was the first time I was in Japan. I went with a Japanese girlfriend of mine, and we went to this fancy buffet, and I was so excited. All of the food looked so beautiful. And but she was just kind of telling me a little bit about, okay, this is what you need to do. This is a little bit different than how it is in the US. And at the time, I think I only spoke a little bit of Japanese. So I was just listening to her advice. And she said, okay, get whatever you want, but be sure that you eat everything that you take from the buffet. And I was just appalled. I was like, what? Why would I have to, like, I might want to try something. I might not like it. Like, I'm the customer. What do you mean I have to eat everything that, and I didn't realize, it took me probably longer than what you've described to realize that probably stems from, like, what you're saying is like valuing food and respecting it. And the life and everything that went into making it, instead of just discarding it like we do so often in the US, especially in a buffet setting. It's kind of, free for all. But it made me laugh to hear your story.
It's also quite interesting because the way Japanese respect food is quite different than, say, like, for example, a vegan or vegetarian who just say, I'm going to respect you by not eating you at all, right? But I mean, you guys know Japanese are big meat eaters. They're big plant eaters. They're big fish eaters. They just like everything, right? And so they're like, I'm gonna partake of your life, but I'm gonna also be very grateful for it, and I'm not gonna waste it. And I think, that's kind of a new view, because I either saw it as vegetarianism and veganism, where you don't eat animals, or the other way where you're just a carnivore and eat meat. I always saw those two kind of sides of the spectrum, but it was quite eye-opening. So and I think it is hard from an American perspective, because Americans are just so used to waste. I mean, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs, especially when we go to those all-you-can-eat buffets.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Actually, I had a question about that. I mean, just your viewpoint in terms of, comparing with American culture. Like, you said you're originally from Virginia. I grew up in Maryland, and my parents are Japanese, and so I'm Japanese. I think of myself as Japanese American. My parents raised me not terribly traditionally Japanese. They knew that was born here. I was going to be raised among Americans, and so there weren't anything that like really pressed in terms of like pushed me into making sure that I did this or did that. Even Japanese language, my Japanese is really limited in many ways because I grew up speaking it, but by the time I went to grade school, I was speaking English with friends, and so my parents would speak to me in Japanese. And a lot of after that, 5, 6, 7, 8, when I got older, I was speaking back in English.
Right.
So my ear is great, but speaking back and formulating thoughts, and especially complex ones, is kind of difficult for me. But I mean, that's all just to say, like, it was an interesting sort of. I had my own culture shock, sort of, because in my own mind, I felt like, well, I mean, I understand Japanese, but I have family, friends, and family that came to visit from Japan once in a while, and I would, from the experience with them is how I understood Japan, and so in my own mind, it's like, oh, I have a grasp of it, and certainly there's aspects of it that I did, but I think for me, when I started working for a Japanese company here in the U.S., like, for instance, like business culture was a complete like culture shock to me. There's so many things I wasn't aware of. I thought I did, or I thought I assumed certain things that would be certain ways, but none of that made sense. Some of the things I was saying didn't make sense. And so, but for someone like me, so, in sort of in between these cultures, there's a resistance that sort of happens, it's like, well, I'm not fully Japanese, so maybe I don't have to accept it this way, or maybe it's a little bit different for yourself because you live in Japan. But did you experience any of that kind of like resistance of like, well, I'm American, I don't really need to feel this way or believe this, or adopt these views, or like, where do you stand on it? How did you sort of adopt your approach to sort of like the cross-cultural element? I have my own thoughts and views, and then I'm living among people who may have slightly different approaches to all of that.
I think that I'm still kind of on that journey, because when I first came here, I was very American in my identity, and I'm like, I'm going to do the American things, and I don't have to be like the Japanese. And so I'm going to celebrate all my American holidays, and I'm going to raise my kids, and I'm going to like Americans, and I'm going to buy a jogging stroller, and I'm going to buy a double stroller, and I'm going to buy a foldable stroller, and I'm going to buy one of those little trailers you hook to your bicycle. I'm just going to do all the American things, And I think that I was like that for the longest time. I was I love Japan, and I was trying to fit into the community, but I was very American in my identity, in my belief system, in my values. But then, like I said, around the time of that TED Talk, I started to shift, and I think since then I've been kind of going through like an identity crisis, where I think because I feel like Japan saved my life. I feel like the food culture saved me. I think I would have probably died of that eating disorder if I hadn't had met the itadakimasu spirit, right? And so I think I kind of shifted a little bit too far in the other direction, where I tried very hard to be more Japanese than a Japanese person, right? So I'm gonna learn how to wear a kimono, and I'm gonna learn how to play the shamisen, and I'm going to do everything better than a Japanese person would ever do to prove that I love Japan, right? And I think 2 years ago I naturalized and became a Japanese citizen, and that was another thing, like because Japan doesn't really what it means to be Japanese. Like, people would see you as more Japanese than they would see me as more Japanese because you have Japanese blood and I don't. That's just the culture, right? And so I found that I wasn't getting accepted by people as being a real Japanese after I got naturalized. And I'm like, I have to be more Japanese than they are in order for them to accept me. And so I kept trying hard but I can wear a kimono and I can play the shamisen and I can sing enka songs, so that's very Japanese, and I
That
sing
is very Japanese.
and I sing the Japanese national anthem at karaoke,
Wow.
I'm very Japanese,
Nice.
and so I think when I did that, I think I lost a little bit of my identity, which was as an American, which I think not just as American, but just who I've always been, And I think I was trying too hard to be Japanese, too hard to be accepted. And I realized about maybe a year or so ago, like, I don't have to be completely Japanese to be Japanese. I don't know any Japanese people other than me who sing the national anthem at karaoke. There's lots of Japanese who don't like natto. There's lots of Japanese who don't like sushi, and who can't wear a kimono. I don't have to be more Japanese. And I kind of am finding myself kind of balancing a little bit back. And, but honestly, I do still feel like I'm kind of in the midst of an identity crisis. To tell you the truth, I find myself in the last 10 years, I've changed so much in how I view things. Like, I've always been a very devout Christian, but I find myself way more comfortable on the grounds of a shrine than I do at church, and I try to figure out, well, how does that fit into my worldview and to my identity? And then, there's things like raising my kids. I find myself doing things way more like a Japanese parent would do than an American parent would do. And so, when I naturalize, a lot of people would say to me, well, you're just a Japanese on paper. And I'm like, yeah, that's not completely correct. I mean, I do feel like my identity has shifted in a lot of ways, for example, my husband is very Japanese or very American. He's and I think part of that is because he's a naturalized American. He immigrated from the Philippines when he was a kid. And I think that naturalized people are a lot more patriotic and have a lot stronger of identity with their home culture than maybe people who are born there. Right. And so he's very American in the way that he thinks. And I remember one time we had this argument. The tokonoma in the washitsu in the Japanese tatami room. There's that little enclave where people put like a vase or like a scroll or whatever. And we put a keyboard on there because my daughter was learning how to play the piano because it was the perfect size for a keyboard. And one of my Japanese friends came over and like, we don't put keyboards in the tokonoma. It's like a very sacred space. And I'm like, well, then I don't want to like offend any Japanese people who come over to my house. And so I told my husband, let's move it. And he was like, but we're not Japanese. Why do we have to do that? Like, it's perfect size for a keyboard. Why do we have to move it when it's the perfect size for a keyboard? Yeah. So we kind of had a little argument about that. Like, well, he's like, well, we're not Japanese. We don't have to be exactly like them. But I was like, well, yeah, but if it's going to make people, uncomfortable, then there's no reason for us to have a keyboard there, and so we would kind of have like a little cultural, it's almost like an international marriage sometimes. I feel like my identity has changed so much. So, but, I've given a lot of talks recently, and I always ask people at my lectures, what does it mean to you to be Japanese? And it's been very interesting to get different answers. Like, Daniel, do you feel like you're Japanese? If someone said, are you Japanese? How would you respond to that question?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my answer changes depending on who is asking me.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, because if it's someone who's American and they say, oh, are you Japanese? I tend to say yes, because maybe, on a relative scale, maybe more Japanese than they are. But, if I'm like, for instance, somebody at work, ask me, are you Japanese? I tend to say I'm American. Right. And, because I don't want to give people the impression that, for instance, language, I can speak just like they can, or I understand, the business culture as well as they do. So it kind of depends. I shape my answer based off of who is asking me in the context in which, that question is being provided.
I often ask because, people in Japan, they use the word Japanese almost every day. But if you ask someone, well, what does that mean? Nobody can give you an answer. It's quite fascinating. And depending on the group you're talking to, they'll give you an answer. And I said, so is someone like Daniel, who's born and raised in the U.S. but has Japanese roots, more Japanese than my daughters who are born and raised in Japan but have American roots. And I'll be like, what do you think about that? And they'll be like, oh, wakara. Because if you actually like get them thinking about it, well, how about a Japanese who's born and raised in Japan and then they naturalize to the States, they stop being Japanese just because they lose their Japanese citizenship. And they're like, well, no. And so I'm like, well, then what does it mean to be Japanese? And it's just, the more they talk about it, the deeper it gets. And it's because the US is more of a melting pot of different people. So there's really, like, for example, in Japanese, you say, "Anata wa nanijin desu ka?" Right? What kind of, you can't say that in English, right?
Yeah, you're right.
There's not an English way to say that. Like, what kind of person are you, right? There's like, where are you from?
Where are you from?
Or where's your hometown? Or like, where, but there's no way to ask what person are you kind of thing, right? And so, and even in the Japanese nationality law, it never mentions the word Nihonjin ever. It says Nihon kokumin, so Japanese
people.
Right. So there's no legal definition of Japanese. And so it's quite fascinating to get people's feedback about what it means to be Japanese to them. But I'm still trying to figure it out. Like I'm very proud to call myself Japanese, but that doesn't mean that I have to stop being American either. It doesn't mean I have to choose one or the other. So I call myself a Beikei Nihonjin, because there's no word, because Japanese has no word for really a naturalized citizen that is not racist. The only words they have are kind of racist. There's a word they use online as an insult called a kikajin. But it's quite of an insult to use the word kikajin. The Japanese government never really uses it. Or anybody in the media, but it's kind of someone's way of saying, well, you're not Japanese, but you're not a foreigner either, so you're kind of in this gray zone, of a kikajin.
Yeah.
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been seeing, I don't know how at length we want to discuss this, but I've been seeing people talking about how they say gaijin, but as in like damage instead of
the kanji.
The kanji, yeah. I don't know. I've been seeing that lately, but
yeah, I
how do you
think
feel about that?
that's mainly online. I think, there's a lot. The Japanese online community is just really bad. There's a lot of racism, but I don't see that very much in the community or people around me. I've been very accepted, and honestly, like the best way to be happy in Japan is something I've figured out, because you can find racism or people excluding you anywhere you look, in any culture, in any country, and of course it exists here too. But if you try to be accepted like as by the culture as a whole or by the country as a whole, I think you'll be disappointed. But if you just you make yourself a happy community around you, you make yourself some good friends, some good colleagues at work, and you get along with them and they accept you and they see you as one of their own, I think that's more than enough for me. And I think that's the best way to be happy, because, there's, Japan has always been an exclusive society. It's always been a homogeneous society in a lot of respects. And that's not anything new, And so, someone who's trying so hard to be Japanese or to be exactly like a Japanese person, I think it's going to be hard to be happy, honestly, because, you're just never going to experience that acceptance from the, no one's going to look at me as a white, blonde, blue-eyed American woman and say, oh, she might be Japanese. Nobody's going to think that,
right.
Yeah.
But if they, when I go to a hotel and they say, can I see your residency card? And I say, I'm Japanese. They're like, oh, okay. And then nobody yet has not believed me. No one has said, show me your passport, nothing. They're like, okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
good.
I think Japan is changing in a lot of ways and becoming a lot more accepting as it becomes more diversified,
That's really good to hear. Yeah. Actually, I just had this conversation with a friend. They asked me like, oh, well, would you ever live in Japan? And like everything that I know, like tells me that I don't know that it would be a truly comforting experience because of what you just said. This idea that when people look at you, and then so for me, my parents are Japanese, but I have a different biological father, so I'm half Black, half Japanese by blood, but grew up with 2 Japanese parents, but I don't look traditionally Japanese. And so, and I've actually shared on some other shows kind of some of that experience where I have 2 younger brothers. They're technically half brothers, so they look Japanese,
Right.
and there's a slight difference of treatment when we go as a family, and then and I shared this funny story about how people will try to approach me and try to speak English, even though I have, in a certain setting, I'm speaking back in Japanese, and, certainly back in the past when we took trips to Japan, my Japanese was probably better than my younger brothers. And so, but for those reasons, like there's hesitations, or a feeling of hesitation within me that's like, I don't know if I were to go there and live there, there's a part of me that feels like, I don't know if I would ever truly feel like, if there was a part of me that felt like the experience that you're saying, like I want to do everything to make sure that people accept me as Japanese, and then always feeling like there's something that comes up short because I may not look like them, or there's certain parts of my experience that I don't share with them. But it sounds like what you're saying is some of that is changing, and so I'm curious to hear.
It is, but still, I mean, you ask a Japanese person, is a hafu like you, is a half a Japanese, and they'll be like, no, they're half. And I'll be like, well, isn't a half a Japanese? No, a half is a half. What I mean?
Are you going to round up or round down?
You go to America, and someone who's biracial is American, and Canada,
right.
biracial person is Canadian,
totally.
But in Japan, a half is a half.
Right.
And that, I mean, there's been data that says maybe 1 in 30 kids born today are half or biracial kids.
Oh wow!
So it's it's increasing, but it's still there's still that
stigma.
The just looks are so big here. I mean,
they
just can't get over it. Like in their hearts, they know that Japan is changing, but there's always going to be that like, but your face is not Japanese kind of thing. That it's just really got a stronghold, I think, on the culture. And so half kids get a lot of things. Like, for example, if 2 Japanese kids have a fight at elementary school, they'll say stuff like baka or aho or whatever, you stupid jerk, idiot, whatever. But, if a half kid fights with a Japanese kid, they'll say kunie kaide, right? Go home, And so I think that kind of stuff that is something that half kids experience. And then there's kids like mine who are not half kids, but born, foreign kids with foreign roots, born and raised in Japan. They have different kinds of struggles, I think, than half kids might. They in their identity and in their education and in their language are completely Japanese, I think. Well, maybe not in their identity, but in their language ability and their education. But every day people will say to them almost, your Japanese is so good. You speak like a native speaker. You can write kanji. That's so cool. And they're just kind of like, yeah, whatever, sure, whatever. So I think that's something they struggle with. My oldest daughter she's 20 now, and she's living in the U.S. now, but she has this massive identity issues living here. Like she told me one day, she goes, I have never felt like I could be myself in Japan. That's what she told me. Not once. She said, not even one day. And, as someone who loves Japan, it was really hard to hear, because, as parents, we decide to live in Japan because we like it here, but the kids have no choice,
right.
where they're born. And she resented me for probably at least 10 years. She, like, why do I have to live in Japan? I'm not Japanese. And
she was born in Japan?
She was born and raised here. I always went to Japanese schools.
Okay.
And she was pretty fine until COVID. COVID just messed up a lot of people, I think.
True.
But she's very, very different than I am. She hates sticking out. She hates having any attention drawn to her. And people would look at her everywhere she goes, and because she's quite beautiful, well, at least in my opinion, as her mother. But and people would look at her, and she hated people look at her, and she, people would always say how good her Japanese was, or they would ask her about America, and she's like, I don't know, I don't live there, I don't know anything about America, don't ask me about that, and she just wanted to be like everybody else, but she never got that, and so And then she goes to the U.S. I sent her. She had all that. She was, futoko and hikikomori and all that stuff, and sent her to the U.S. when she was second year in high school to study abroad in a high school in Texas, and she really enjoyed. She thrived being in a multicultural environment where she didn't stick out, but she couldn't follow. She could not keep up with the studies at school. She could not follow along with the English. Yeah, I mean, she speaks English fluently, but she's never written even an essay, and all of a sudden they're telling her to write a research paper.
Right.
Yeah, an academic setting.
An academic paper. She's never studied U.S. history before, and she's in all of a sudden she's in high school history class. I mean, she really struggled. So she comes back just like, Mommy, I don't know if I'm Japanese. I don't know if I'm American. I'm so confused.
Oh,
and so, there's been, I love Japan, but it's definitely, there's struggles raising kids here. My other two kids don't really have many identity issues as of now, but, my youngest daughter is actually in Korea. She's a K-pop trainee.
I saw that. I saw that
wow.
you posted that. I saw it, and you went to visit her recently, didn't you?
Yeah. I go visit her every couple months. But she's very laid back and just, I don't think she knows or really cares about her identity. She just wants to be an idol. It's just interesting. You can raise your kids the exact same way, and they just turn out and have different personalities, and they're just totally different.
Thank you very much for tuning in to the Oops in Translation podcast. We'll have more on our interview with Anne Crescini next time, and her information will be below in the show notes. So for now, please like the show, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell for updates. And with that, we'll see you next time. Ciao.